Good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the annual Ambedkar Lectures at Barnard in Columbia. I'm Anupama Rao. I teach in the History Department at Barnard, in MISAS, and I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. The lectures were begun last year to commemorate one of the great figures in the history of modern democratic thought, and Columbia's alumnus, Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. In coming years, we will continue to think across discipline to consider Ambedkar's relevance for South Asia and to stage broader conversations around political thought, historical comparison, and inequality, issues that were of great interest and importance to him. I should also mention that our lectures today and tomorrow evening will be followed by an event at the New School next weekend, starting October 24th, and ending on the evening of October the 26th, called The Unfinished Legacy of B.R. Ambedkar. So please do join us for tomorrow evening and for events next week. Now this evening is devoted to an engagement with the intellectual history of the interwar, Columbia's important role in the formation of the social science disciplines, and the development of American pragmatism. These are complex legacies. Let me note and elaborate on the entailments of a few of them. Race and caste were analytic constructs that assumed social presence and distinct pertinence in the interwar, as the human sciences, especially sociology and anthropology, challenged and repurposed ideas about biological difference via notions of linguistic and cultural diffusion. These disciplines also drew upon notions of progress and development, except temporal backwardness was now mapped onto space, thus becoming a powerful ally and an alibi for colonization. We might also recall Columbia's relationship to the New School for Social Research, which was founded by a group of dissident Columbia professors, including the pragmatist John Dewey, who taught Ambedkar and exerted a lifelong influence on his thought and writings about the cultivation of moral worth and democratic disposition for true civility. Dewey's influence is most evident in Ambedkar's 1936 text, The Annihilation of Caste, which was prepared for a talk that Ambedkar later self-published, when his invitation to speak was rescinded due to the incendiary content of his talk, which predicated caste's annihilation on an exit from Hinduism, in the process reanimating the tension between religion and politics as both imminent and ongoing. And then there is the insistent presence of our neighbor, Parliament, an incubator of social knowledge which continues to be viewed through the prism of racial anxiety and discourses of rescue and uplift, rather than of neighborliness and hospitality. We continue to live with these histories of the inside and the outside of the university, of those who spoke truth to power within the university's gates, and those who were excluded, or to use Bjorn Ambedkar's term, outcasted. Their missed connections and necessary reckoning is the theme of this evening's gathering. Our speakers this evening focus on African American political and moral philosophy. My interest in hosting them this evening is twofold. The first is to signal Ambedkar's own remarkable synthesis of ideas drawn from American republicanism, the British and German social democratic traditions, and Buddhist revival. Shout out to the student researchers, growing in number, who are working on our Columbia University and Ambedkar course. Nikhil Mayur, a young art student in Lucknow, produced the poster image that we've used for this evening that we're calling Obama Ambedkar. No doubt this is an immediate reference, although I believe Nikhil is also gesturing to emergent solidarities between Ambedkar and the left, between Marx and Ambedkar. I'd now like to introduce to you the Dean of Social Sciences, Fred Harris, who will welcome our gathering this evening. Dean Harris's support has been critical, and his own scholarship on African American politics has strong affinities with our discussion this evening, as it locates leadership and political persuasion at the very heart of the project of social transformation. I'll be back after his remarks to offer very brief introductions to our speakers and commentators, and then we'll get started. Let me introduce Dean Harris, who is Dean of Social Science, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Center on African American Politics and Society. Professor Professor Harris has also served as the VP of the American Political Science Association, a senior fellow at Brookings, visiting scholar at the Russell Sage, fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and as a visiting professor at the Panthéon Sorbonne in Paris. His most recent prize-winning book is The Price of the Ticket, Barack Obama and the Rise and Decline of Black Politics. He's also authored Something Within, Religion and African American Political Activism, which won multiple book awards, and he's co-authored books on African American activism and on racial inequality in a post-racist Europe. His essays also appear in Dissent, the London Review of Books, the New York Times, Society, Souls, Transition, and the Washington Post. Dean Harris, thank you for being with us.
Wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to provide some introductory remarks for this evening's celebration for its event. I look forward to hearing the papers. As Dean of Social Sciences here at Columbia, I often reflect on the important role social scientists must play in informing the collective understanding of our world. There are few who can match the model of citizen, scholar, activist set forth by B.R. Ambedkar during his decades of work and service in the last century. In preparing my remarks this evening, I received Ambedkar's biography, and while his scholarly accomplishments are impressive, they only hint at the impact and long-ranging significance of his work beyond the academy. Columbia's institutional relationship to Ambedkar is familiar to us, but I think it is fitting to review some of it. Ambedkar's earned what were to be the first of several advanced degrees at Columbia, just over a century ago, working under the tutelage, as we've just been told, of John Dewey. He focused his work in economics, but he also studied here in Morningside Heights. His studies here encompass nearly all of the social science disciplines: anthropology, economics, history, and sociology. And he integrated his interests in the social sciences with his interest in political philosophy. From his course of study, it appears that Columbia had a role in establishing a cross-disciplinary expertise that would be a defining feature of Ambedkar's life's work. Following the completion of 2 master's degrees at Columbia, Ambedkar continued his postgraduate studies at the London School of Economics, where he earned a doctorate there and eventually earned a doctorate in economics from Columbia before moving into the legal profession. It should be evident to all of us that Ambedkar was possessed of a probing, omnipresent intellect. Yet his training and scholarship pointed him beyond campus libraries to a decidedly radical engagement with the Indian independence movement. His work brought his energy and intelligence to the role of community advocate, working on behalf of those who historically had been excluded from full human rights and for whom a system of oppression was defining. He worked in behalf of the Dalit, the so-called untouchables of the Indian society. From a post in the legal profession, he became a champion of the outcasts, on whose behalf he helped to found periodicals, promoted education and socioeconomic mobility, and galvanized organized opposition to India's caste system. His public engagement as a voice of those on the margins of society flowed into a political career where Ambedkar brought intellectual clarity to a delicate, difficult realm of governance. He set himself along a generation of peers to the monumental task of forging a new nation in India, one free from colonial rule and free in his vision of the hierarchical overlay of the caste system, which he challenged as discriminatory and exclusionary. Here is where we acknowledge and celebrate Ambedkar's lasting legacy as the champion of his country's disadvantage. He saw with moral clarity that the dissolution of British colonial rule presented his nation with an opportunity to uplift the most marginalized members of his society. He brought their cause to the innermost discussions of the Indian independence movement, and as the lead author of India's Constitution, he acknowledged the lasting impact of his work on that foundational document. This evening talks grant us the opportunity to reflect in a manner befitting such a historic legacy. It is obvious to state that our world continues to grapple with discrimination, exclusion, and hierarchy. But plainly, Ambedkar's work is ongoing, and we are gathered to discuss themes of his activism on two specific topics. This evening, you will hear papers related to the theme on race, caste, and American pragmatism. And tomorrow's discussion will focus on remaking publics, gender, effect, insurgents, presence. My own specialization within the field of political science, race, and politics touches on Ambedkar's legacy in unique ways. In an essay I wrote in UNESCO's World Social Science Report titled The Hidden Hands of Racial Inequality in the United States, I argued that in order to understand the persistence of racial inequality in the absence of state-sanctioned racism, social practices that are seemingly, quote, race neutral on its face needed to be unraveled. Invisible practices, understood as hidden mechanisms that sustain and perpetuate racial inequality, are vast and are often difficult to pinpoint. They're embedded in economic, social, and political institutions, and are largely overlooked as enablers of racial bias because they do not explicitly reveal how they advantage whites and disadvantage blacks and other stigmatized minorities in the United States. These practices, more frequently understood as institutionalized racism, are just as pernicious and sometimes more so than overt racist practices. During his studies in the US in 1913 and 1960s, Ambedkar developed some of the most enduring ideas about caste as an undemocratic social institution. His time at Columbia and proximity to Harlem appears to have spurred a long life interest in thinking about the crisis of dehumanization across history and an interest in developing remedies to address the problems of society's most marginalized. During the 1940s, Ambedkar wrote a letter to W.E.B. Du Bois requesting copies of a petition submitted by Black Americans to the United Nations that accused the United States of human rights violations. Identifying himself as, quote, a student of the Negro problem, unquote, he belonged to the untouchables of India, he wrote. Ambedkar asserted that, quote, there was so much similarity between the position of untouchables in India and the position of Negroes in America that the study of the latter is not only natural, but necessary, unquote. In his response, Du Bois confirmed that the National Negro Congress, which was a left-wing radical organization during the 40s, what Du Bois described as a small organization, had drafted a statement which he was enclosing, adding that he expected the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People to submit a more comprehensive statement, a copy of which he would be happy to forward. Ending his missive by acknowledging that not only did he know of Ambedkar and his work, Du Bois also conveyed that he had, quote, every sympathy with the untouchables of India. The statement, called a petition to the United Nations on behalf of the 13 million oppressed Negroes, issued in 1946, was followed upon the next year by one from the NAACP entitled An Appeal to the World, a statement on the denial of human rights to minorities in the case of citizens of Negro descent in the United States of America, and appeal to the United Nations for redress. Though the implied audience differed, both of these, and especially the latter given its title, can be seen in the intellectual and political genealogy of David Walker's 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world, in which he proclaimed that, quote, we, the colored people of these United States, are the most wretched, degraded, abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began, unquote. More than a century later, another appeal was being made in the aftermath of the police murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. a murder that ignited what came to be known as the Black Lives Matter movement. In an op-ed piece I penned for the Washington Post entitled, "Will Ferguson Be a Moment or a Movement?" written just 2 weeks after the murder of Mike Brown, I asked insurgents to consider taking their grievances before the United Nations, as did activists such as Du Bois, William Patterson, Paul Robeson, and Malcolm X had. In 2014, the parents of Mike Brown, along with representatives of organizations in Ferguson and Chicago, traveled to Geneva to share information about police brutality, cases against African Americans with the UN Committee Against Torture. Brown's parents submitted a statement to the committee that read in part, "The killing of Mike Brown and the abandonment of his body in the middle of the neighborhood street is but an example of the utter lack of regard for, indeed dehumanization of, Black lives by law enforcement personnel." Similar acts of dehumanization against African Americans have been repeated hundreds of times since. The latest, this past weekend, in a welfare check by police turned into a police murder of Atiana Jefferson in Fort Worth, Texas. The NAACP's 1947 petition to the UN became meaningful for this evening's occasion in the way that the idea of caste was employed to elucidate the conditions blacks face in the US. To quote, "There are in the United States of America 15 million or more native-born citizens, something less than a tenth of the nation, who form a largely segregated caste with restricted legal rights and many illegal disabilities." In his introduction to the petition, Du Bois uses the phrase segregated caste to describe the dialectical effects of the color caste system on blacks. Quote, "The group has long been internally divided by dilemma as to whether its striving upward should be aimed at strengthening its inner cultural and group bonds, both for intrinsic progress and for offensive power against caste." He goes on, "Or whether it should take shape wherever and however possible into the surrounding of American culture." Such historic links suggest the importance of conversations about social justice, democracy, and civil rights in our time. The Ambedkar Lectures and the publication series in his name places Columbia at the forefront of recognizing the enduring contribution of democracy's global footprint. The lectures, the initiative here affords us the opportunity to dig deep within the framework laid out by an intellectual forebear, one of the hidden giants promoting a solution-driven social science, which I champion forthrightly. An exciting part of this evening's program is an engagement with perspectives on African American political thought. One of the appealing aspects of Ambedkar's life is that he serviced his knowledge for the most marginal in Indian society, a knowledge that was used for social change through public engagement. There is a long tradition of this service among African American intellectuals and activists. Even before the advent of what has become known today as Black public intellectuals, an invention that came late in the 20th century, Black public thinkers were known by other names in their communities in other times. They were the new Negro intellectuals at the turn of the 20th century. They became race men and race women by the mid-20th century, and during the activist 60s and 70s, they were known simply as scholar activists. Du Bois was not the only significant voice in this tradition. Among them are the philosopher Alain Locke, leftist journalist and activist Claudia Jones, sociologist Oliver Cromwell Cox, who in 1948 wrote an influential book on race, class, and caste in the United States. It also includes the political scientist and Nobel laureate Ralph Bunche, the economist Eric Williams, who wrote an influential book on capitalism and slavery, and rose to become the first prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago. It includes the psychologist Kenneth and Mamie Clark, whose famous doll experiments on Black children was presented as evidence on the internalized negative effects of white supremacy on black people during the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown decision. There's the philosopher and activist Angela Davis, an influential figure of the Black Power movement, and a present voice in the criminal justice reform movement. And Columbia's own, the late historian, Manning Parable. This evening, we pay homage to Ambedkar and to the tradition of serviceable knowledge that has been part and parcel of the Black intellectual tradition. The thinkers presenting this evening continue in the spirit of Ambedkar and Black public intellectualism, and they are at the forefront of thinking theoretically and philosophically about Black life in the United States. I'm thinking primarily here of Chris Lebron and Professor Melvin Rogers. I'll close now by offering my sincere gratitude to Professor Rao and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society for organizing these events, and I wish to extend a special thanks to all of our participants, many of whom are close colleagues, for their words and their insights. Thank you for coming and helping to further inquiries and discussions about BR and Ambedkar, and which will help to spark conversations for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dean Harris. I'm going to just very briefly introduce our speakers this evening. I don't want to stand between you and them. Each of them will speak in the order of their introduction. They've all been asked to speak for about 20 minutes. And then we'll have 2 sets of comments, each for about 10 minutes or so. And then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A with the audience. So let me begin by introducing Meena Krishnamurthy, Assistant Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Queen's University. Her work on King's views on the role of political emotions in the motivation to end racial justice is forthcoming in a manuscript entitled The Emotions of Nonviolent Resistance, Revisiting MLK and His Letter from Birmingham Jail. She's recently started writing on Indian political thinkers such as Ambedkar, who are concerned with the nature of caste and casteism. Melvin Rogers is Associate Professor of Political Science at Brown, the author of The Undiscovered Dewey, Religion, Morality, and the Ethos of Democracy, which was followed by The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought. This book considers themes of democratic responsiveness, redemption, and faith amid racial injustice. He's also edited John Dewey, The Public and Its Problems, and recently completed African American Political Thought, A Collected History, with Jack Turner. His articles routinely appear in major academic journals as well as popular venues such as Dissent, The Atlantic, Public Seminar, and Boston Review. Chris Lebron is winner of the 2018 Hyatt Prize in the Humanities and Associate Professor of Philosophy at Johns Hopkins, excuse me. His first book, The Color of Our Shame, won the American Political Science Association's Foundation of Political Theory First Book Prize. His second book, The Making of Black Lives Matter, offers an intellectual history of the Black Lives Matter social movement. Chris is an active public intellectual, writing numerous times for the New York Times philosophy column, The Stone, and a wide variety of other publications that include the Boston Review, The Nation, The Atlantic, and Billboard magazine. Our 2 interlocutors and commentators for the evening are Michele Moody-Adams, Joseph Strauss Professor of Political Philosophy and Legal Theory at Columbia University, where she also served as Columbia College and Vice President for Undergraduate Education from 2009 to 2011. She's the author of numerous articles on equality and social justice, moral psychology and the virtues, and the philosophical implications of gender and race. Professor Moody-Adams is the author of the widely cited book on moral relativism entitled Fieldwork in Familiar Places, Morality, Culture, and Philosophy, and her current work includes articles on academic freedom, equal education opportunity, and democratic disagreement. She's currently at work on a book tentatively entitled Renewing Democracy, on the political institutions and political culture essential to achieving justice and promoting stability in multicultural democracies. Ira Katznelson is Columbia University's interim provost, Ruggles Professor of Political Science and History, and Deputy Director of the Columbia World Projects. His 2013 book, Fear Itself, The New Deal and the Origins of Our Time, was awarded the Bancroft Prize in History and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award in Political Science. Other co-authored books include Southern Nation, Congress and White Supremacy, After Reconstruction, and Liberal Beginnings of Republic for the Moderns. He is a Fellow of the British Academy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society, and the former president of both the American Political Science Association and the Social Science Research Council. I'm immensely grateful to all of them for being here with us this evening and for sharing their thoughts with us. Thank you again.
Good evening. Thanks to Professor Rao and everybody else involved in organizing for having us here. I'm especially excited to stand alongside such thoughtful and I think will be thought-provoking panelists. So this is a relatively new project, and I'm excited to talk with you about it tonight. So just a bit of review, which you might have heard already. Ambedkar arrived in New York in, I guess, around 1913, and he stayed until 1916. And he came to the United States to pursue a master's in economics here at Columbia University, importantly for us tonight. He didn't just take classes in economics, of course. He took classes in anthropology, sociology, politics, philosophy, history. So when we think about where Columbia is located, blocks away from Harlem, and about the time that Ambedkar was here in the earliest 20th century, it was a time when hundreds of thousands of Black Americans were migrating to the south into dense urban areas such as Harlem. Alain Locke, a famous Black writer and philosopher of the time, called this period in Harlem a spiritual coming of age. For him, it was among, he says, the first chances for Black thinkers and artists to engage in group expression and self-determination. So Harlem Renaissance thinkers such as Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and Georgia Douglas explored the beauty and pain of Black life. They also sought to challenge stereotypes that were associated with Black people. Now, it's really hard to imagine that these exciting developments that were happening in Black culture at the time and that cultivated the New Negro movement didn't have some kind of influence on Ambedkar's views about the caste question in India. So as we know, Ambedkar didn't leave an account of his time here in New York, but we do know that at a later date he communicated with W.E.B. Du Bois, a prominent Black intellectual and activist who played a key role in the Harlem Renaissance, both as an early proponent and later as a staunch critic. In the letter that he wrote to Du Bois in 1946, Ambedkar states that he knew of Du Bois's work because he, like Du Bois, was working in the cause of securing liberties to the oppressed people. He wrote that he had been a student of the Negro problem and that he had read Du Bois's writings throughout. He also added that there was so much similarity between the positions of the Dalits and Black individuals in America that the study of the latter was not only natural, it was necessary. In response, Du Bois wrote that he was familiar with Ambedkar's name and that he had every sympathy with the Dalits of India. So, as we will see, caste is a focus, I guess, in the writings of both Du Bois and Ambedkar. But today, interestingly, in contemporary, we might read as Western mainstream political philosophy, this is all but an unexplored and is an ignored topic. And I think this is unfortunate. And this is largely because the caste problem was and still is an urgent global problem. As we know, it still exists, not only in India, but among South Asian diaspora that are in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. And I'm going to suggest that it may be of particular importance for those of us in the United States. As Du Bois, Jyotirao Phule, and later Dr. King would argue, the caste problem and the race problem may be one and the same. More recently, Michele Alexander in The New Jim Crow has made a similar claim, arguing that the incarceration of poor people of color in the United States is tantamount to a new caste system. So the purpose of my talk today is to get a bit clearer on Du Bois and Ambedkar's views on the nature of caste. And I think this is important to do because I think it will enlighten us about the nature of racial injustice in the United States, and I think open the door to discussions about how to alleviate it. So the structure of the talk, just to give you a brief overview, is I'm going to start by talking about Du Bois's views on the origin and evolution of the caste problem in the United States. Then I'm going to move on to talk about Ambedkar's views about caste in India. And then in the third section, I'm going to argue that the approach they take to the caste question is pragmatist in nature. And I'll say more about that when we get there. So just to be clear, because Ambedkar and Du Bois both wrote a lot, I'm really going to focus my talk here on two pieces: Du Bois' evolution of the race problem, and Ambedkar's Caste in India, their mechanism, genesis, and development. The second paper, Ambedkar's paper, just as a kind of fact, he wrote while he was in an anthropology seminar here at Columbia, so it may be of particular interest to us. So Du Bois says that the problem of the past, so far as the Black American was concerned, began with caste, a definite place preordained in custom, law, and religion, where all men of black blood must be thrust. So the race problem of the United States was a caste problem in Du Bois' view. Initially, he says that the caste problem took form in the practice of slavery. He wrote, men came to the idea of exclusive black slavery by gradually enslaving the workers and then gradually conceding certain sorts of works and certain colors of men as necessarily connected. So the idea of enslaved labor gets linked with blackness. And then because of this inextricable link, before abolition that is, if you were born black, then being enslaved was inescapable. After the abolition of slavery and the establishment of voting rights, Du Bois suggests that the caste program starts to take a bit of a different form. In particular, it resurfaces as the movement to disenfranchise black people. So at the time, he sort of suggests that white folks are making a variety of arguments for the disenfranchisement of black people, and these arguments were sort of formulated on three propositions. The first proposition was that they said it was a mistake to give black Americans the vote in the first place. Why? Because they argued that black Americans belong to an inferior race. They then argued that the only way to solve the problem is legal recognition of this inferiority. Now, in the United States, as most of us know, voting rights were and still are a way of establishing democratic citizenship, which is the basis for equal social status in the United States. So giving black Americans the right to vote controverted the racial hierarchy that slavery had imposed on black Americans. In arguing that black Americans' rights to vote should be revoked, white Americans were claiming that black Americans should be returned to their inferior social status or caste. In defense of this, Du Bois argues that white Americans offered a variety of spurious justifications. They claimed that black people were incapable of intellectual development. But as Du Bois notes, when emancipated black people gained a solid education and became literate and literary, the explanation changes. They then claimed that black Americans lacked the work ethic and the capacity to save money. When black people worked hard and saved enough money to accumulate property, then the standard shifts yet again. As Du Bois wrote, no sooner do facts like these come to the fore than again the ground of the opposition suddenly shifts. Now, Du Bois noted, they claim that black people are inferior by nature, and you can't, he says, legislate against nature. So justification for disenfranchisement becomes almost incontrovertible because of this link with nature. So the shifting of grounds is what we now refer to as the shifting goalposts of respectability politics. Just do X and you'll be respectable enough to merit Y, where Y is some resource such as the right to vote. But then once you do X, the standard changes. In essence, this shifting meant that the standards for gaining the right to vote and later other resources, and in turn the right to social equality, was unattainable for black Americans. There was simply no way, he argued, to escape the legacy of slavery in the United States. So we see then this notion of inescapability or the unattainability of equal social status that follows from this shifting of standards is essential to Du Bois' notion of caste. So then Du Bois asks, what changed since abolition when many white Americans supported emancipation and voting rights for black Americans? Interestingly enough, Du Bois suggests that it was the spread of the social philosophy of social Darwinism. So that's the view that there is inherent inequality among humans that cannot and should not be eliminated. It's the view that civilization is a struggle of existence, and weaker individuals will gradually succumb, and the strong will inherit the earth. So Du Bois argues that it's the spread of this social philosophy that led abolitionists to give up on their egalitarian cause, and in turn, he says, the American caste system ends up being reborn. Of course, as Du Bois noted, white people didn't genuinely accept social Darwinism. He suggests that on some level they knew that inequality wasn't inherent or permanent. How could they not? All they had to do was look around the world, right, and see the rise of black people after emancipation, and looking at the rise of people of color around the world. These things make it clear that black people were, he says, on every legitimate measure equal to white people. So in other words, this kind of ignorance of this inherent equality of people is something that's put on, or to use a phrase from Moody-Adams, is a kind of affect, a kind of, using a word from Charles Mills, white ignorance, right? It's something that's put on. So why would Americans accept a social philosophy that sought to keep black people down, if they knew otherwise? The answer is simple in Du Bois' view. White Americans' acceptance of this philosophy was grounded in self-interest and a desire for self-esteem. Giving up on the inherent inequality of the races would mean a loss in pride and prejudice for white people who, he argues, derive much of their self-value from being placed above black Americans. It would mean accepting the possibility of a white person blackening a black man's roots. It could also mean intermarriage and dilution of the boundaries between races, which Du Bois argues was viewed as the ultimate threat to the existence of the white race and the social privileges that came with it. As we will see, in many ways, white Americans were, and perhaps still are, the Brahmins of the United States. With this, let's turn now to Ambedkar's views on caste in India. So according to Ambedkar, caste is a form of social stratification. It's a set of rigid boundaries, or what he calls watertight compartments. It's also passed along hereditary transmission of occupation and a status in a social hierarchy. We see some parallels to Du Bois' view. So while Brahmins, the so-called intellectuals or priestly caste, have the highest status, Dalits, the unskilled laboring caste, have the lowest status in Hindu society. As we saw with Du Bois, the central threat to caste, or race in his case, is the weakening of boundaries between races. And intermarriage is the ultimate threat because it can lead to the dissolution of these boundaries. So this is why Ambedkar says that the greatest threat to caste is what he called the problem of the surplus man and woman. So for caste to persist, men and women must marry and have children with individuals in their own caste. The goal is to reproduce the boundaries of caste over across generations. And so for this to keep happening, there has to be an equal number of marriageable men and women within a given caste. When there's a surplus man and a surplus woman, and they can't find suitable partners in their own caste, well then obviously, Ambedkar argues, they're going to be driven to marry and to have sex and children with people outside of their own caste. The creation of progeny blurs the boundaries of caste and threatens to undermine the entire caste system. So this is why, according to Ambedkar, endogamy is imposed. Endogamy is a practice of marrying only within the limits of a local community, clan, or tribe, or in this case, caste. It's an attempt to resolve disparity between the number of marriageable men and women. So how do we get these problems of surplus men and women? Well, one way we get them right is when a woman's husband dies early. Now we have to figure out what to do to bring equality back in terms of numbers of men and women, so what do? Well, Ambedkar says that the easiest way to prevent the surplus of women is to ensure that the woman is simply disposed of. So the practice of sati, the practice of wives being burned on their husband's funeral pyre, and enforced widowhood are ways of dealing with surplus women. Because through these practices, women are not eligible for marriage or sex with anyone at all, let alone those outside of their caste. Now, of course, the same problem can arise with men, right? Their wives can die early. But unlike women, we can't treat them in the same way. They can't simply be disposed of. Why? It's amazing. I mean, we're so clear about this. It's because of patriarchy. Men are not ever going to be treated in the same way as women. So we can't just get rid of men. because we then create an ideology that suggests that they're essential to families and procreation and the maintenance of caste. So what do we do then? We have to solve this problem of the surplus man. Well, we look to the group of women that is typically not marriageable, girl children. So we see then that endogamy, this practice of maintaining marriage within a caste, is basically enacted or put into practice through sati, girlhood marriage, and widowhood. So not only are those conditions terrible for women, they actually make caste for both men and women inescapable. So how and why did caste originate? Is Ambedkar's next question. He says the strict observance of these customs and the social superiority arrogated by the priestly class in all ancient civilizations are sufficient to prove that they, the Brahmins, were the originators of this unnatural institution, founded and maintained through these unnatural means. So, in his view, Brahmins were the first to institute caste. But this raises the question, why did Brahmins go to all of this trouble to maintain these strict boundaries? So following Du Bois, Ambedkar writes repeatedly, that Brahmins are selfish. They simply sought to protect their self-interest by entrenching a system that gave them prestige and power. They also relied on social philosophy, They crafted a religious philosophy of Hinduism that was encoded in the laws of money to not only justify a social hierarchy, but to also justify their superior position within it. So what was natural was soon viewed as being unnatural because it's encoded in the laws, the religious laws, and this left very little basis for challenging the caste system. Again, we see parallel ideas to those of Du Bois. Soon, other groups sought to secure social esteem for themselves by imitating Brahmins and using religious philosophy to turn themselves into enclosed castes. According to Ambedkar, this is how the caste system in India originated and why it continues to persist today. So far I've given you a brief, rather quick overview of Du Bois and Ambedkar's views on the nature and evolution of caste. Now I want to talk a little bit about their pragmatist solution to the caste problem. So we know that pragmatism was central to both Du Bois and Ambedkar's approach to social and political philosophy. Du Bois studied with William James, he worked with John Dewey in the NAACP, and Ambedkar was Dewey's student at Columbia, and we know that his copy of Dewey's Democracy and Education was filled with underlines and annotation and was quoted prolifically throughout Ambedkar's work. So we know that pragmatism was important to both of their approaches. Of course, pragmatism has a lot of different meanings. So I just want to focus on one for the purposes of today. So I want to focus on meliorism, which is the belief that the world can be made better by human effort. It's often thought of as a middle way between pessimism and optimism. So James says about meliorism, there are unhappy men who think the salvation of the world impossible. Theirs is the doctrine known as pessimism. Optimism, in turn, would be the doctrine that thinks the world's salvation inevitable. Meliorism, in contrast, treats salvation as neither necessary nor impossible. It treats it as a possibility the more numerous the actual conditions become. Dewey echoes James. He says, meliorism maintains a certain intellectual pessimism in the sense of steadfast willingness to uncover sore points, to acknowledge and search for abuses, and to note how presumed good often serves as a cloak for actual bad. So in his view, like James, optimism can blind us to the real problems that exist, directing our attention to the wrong places, while meliorism moves us to look at the world and to try and overcome the problems we see. And in doing so, as Eddie Glaude notes, such a view encourages us to inquire into the amelioration of problems and the obstructions to their resolution. So this is in part why the causal analysis, looking at caste and how it originated, and looking at the causal conditions for caste were very important, because they thought that in getting clearer on the causal mechanisms, we could get clear on how to resolve the caste problem. So in light of this analysis, what is their proposed solution to the caste problem? Well, in Evolution of the Race Problem, Du Bois was very clearly abolition. Ambedkar doesn't say in that paper in Caste in India, he doesn't say what his solution is, but we know in later work that he too thinks that annihilation is the right way forward. Both of them think that we have to somehow get rid of the caste system, and by this they mean we need to break down the horizontal barriers between castes. this work of breaking down the caste system. Influenced by his work in caste in India, Ambedkar is clear in his later work, The Annihilation of Caste, that we can't depend on Brahmins to abolish the caste system. So because of his divine basis in the Vedas, the caste system is thought to be sacred. Ambedkar suggests that we can't ask Brahmins to go against their religious convictions. Moreover, and more importantly, he argued Brahmins would never end a practice that gives them social esteem and power. This would go against their own interests. And so this is why he said that the Brahmin can be no revolutionary. I think Du Bois suggests something similar in his later work. If we think about The Souls of White Folks, for example, he writes, the number of white individuals who are practicing with even reasonable approximation of the kind of selfish and unselfishness that's needed for democracy. The number, he says, is so small and so unimportant as to be fit subject for jest. It's laughable. So he doesn't think that white folks are really going to be the path to eradicating the caste system. Towards the end of his life, Du Bois argued that what was needed for moral progress was a global coalition of darker oppressed peoples. So when Ambedkar wrote Du Bois, he actually was asking Du Bois for a copy of a petition that the NAACP, under Du Bois' leadership, had filed with the United Nations, which was appealing to the United Nations to protect the civil rights of Black Americans. Ambedkar had hoped to do the same thing on behalf of Dalits in India. So we can see here, this is kind of putting into practice what they thought was the way forward, which was darker or oppressed peoples across the world working hand in hand to end the oppression that they faced. Now, how exactly might they move forward? Over the course of their lives, they suggested a lot of different paths. Like, so we all work together, what should we be doing together? They suggested a lot of different things, right? Some of those were institutional and legal, some of them were cultural. But by the end of their lives, and I think we might take this as their final or ultimate solution, both Du Bois and Ambedkar engage in a kind of exodus. Du Bois leaves the United States for Ghana after he was arrested on false charges and had his American passport revoked. And just before he left, he reportedly told a good friend of his, chin up and fight on, but realize that American Negroes can't win. Now, as a final assessment of the United States, Du Bois' statement and his decision to leave might be viewed pessimistically, as Du Bois giving up on the idea of abolishing the racial caste system in the United States. Paul Taylor suggests a different interpretation. He sees Du Bois' statement as a confirmation of his pragmatism. Du Bois doesn't say that Negroes can't win, which would be a pessimistic appraisal of the situation. What he says is that American Negroes can't win. Given that Du Bois was on his way to Ghana, Taylor sees the statement as an affirmation of his Pan-Africanism. It was his recognition that winning for Black people meant rejecting the idea of America, at least as it stood. Not permanently, but at least as it stood. Du Bois had long argued that the idea of America was wrapped up with caste, white supremacy, capitalism, and exploitation of Black people. He came to believe that if Black people could extricate themselves from the idea of America and from the political arrangements that gave expression to this idea, then there was hope for them. As Taylor notes, Du Bois went to Ghana not in despair, but with a peculiar hopefulness. Hopefulness for what was possible among the darker people of Ghana and Africa more broadly. I think something similar can be said about Ambedkar. So Ambedkar says, in this quote, he may have been born a Dalit. That wasn't something that he had a choice over. But he does have a choice as to whether he continues to stay a Dalit. And he assures us that he won't. And he says he won't die as a Hindu. And he was good to his promise. 6 months before he died, he converted to Neo or Navayana Buddhism. Now, I want to suggest here that Ambedkar also had a melioristic approach. He ultimately believed that changes in law and policy were not enough to solve the caste problem. The only way forward was for Dalits to liberate themselves from the idea of Hinduism altogether and to convert to Navayana or Neo-Buddhism, a form of Buddhism that Ambedkar had reinterpreted to sort of center or focus on social equality and justice. So we could read Ambedkar's conversion as an expression of pessimism, a final giving up on Hinduism, but I think taking a note from Taylor, I want to suggest it was actually an expression of his meliorism. Like Du Bois, Ambedkar saw his withdrawal from Hinduism as hopefully carving the way forward for a new generation of Dalits who could escape the caste system and have a sense of social equality. So I started this talk by suggesting that studying Du Bois and Ambedkar and caste was of particular importance to us within the United States. In the end, Du Bois and Ambedkar offer us a pragmatist solution to the racial caste problem. What this means then, and this may not suggest a concrete path forward, but what it does suggest is that we not only need a determined skepticism of the idea of America, we also need a committed meliorism to fight on against this idea, whether that is within or outside of America itself. Thank you.
So first of all, let me say thank you for the invitation. I'm so delighted to be here with all of you. Unlike Meena, I will not have slides, so I apologize. And we're going to see how we're going to do on this time, okay? So the title of my talk today is Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, and the Danger of Political Pessimism. So there's a broadly Afro-pessimistic story that animates contemporary reflections of racial justice in the United States. And here is the story in its contemporary time. The frequency with which Black people die at the hands of the police, the ongoing problems, the economic inequality Black people experience, and the fundamental insecurity to Black life, not chiefly of their own making, is not an anomaly in the United States. A line can be drawn from the earliest periods of African American life in this country to the present moment, in which we see again and again the nation's foundational commitment to anti-Blackness. Indeed, anti-Blackness appears to be a precondition for American democracy's survival. Precondition here cashes itself out in two related ways. The first is an identitarian claim, namely that whiteness in the United States gains its meaning by virtue of being contrasted to those that stand outside it, that is, those who are non-white. Black people are not the only non-whites, but they function for complicated historical reasons as the quintessential non-whites. This identitarian claim is tied to the second normative claim, namely that the meaningfulness of whiteness is captured by a set of goods, political, ethical, material, psychological, that non-whites do not enjoy and must be denied if the identitarian claim is to remain intact. Thus, the denial to Black people of these goods is the expressive hallmark of the proper functioning of American democracy. American democracy, or so the story goes, is working as it should when the meaning of whiteness remains intact, and we know the meaning of whiteness remains intact when the enjoyment of those goods identified above are confined to white Americans and denied to non-whites, especially Black people. The practice of denying these goods to Black people, as the historical record shows, knows no bounds. The philosopher Calvin Warren tells us, quote, "It is the humiliated, incarcerated, mutilated, terrorized Black body that serves as the vestibule for the democracy that is to come." Warren stands in a tradition of thinking known as Afro-pessimism that includes scholars such as Jared Saxton and Frank Wilderson. All viewed the persistence of racial inequality as the vulnerability of Black life and the vulnerability of Black life as the inescapable afterlife of slavery. This condition in which African Americans work, live, and struggle leads, as Juliet Hooker and Barnard Hess tell us, to a fundamental conundrum. Quote, "One of the fundamental paradoxes of Black politics is the invariable futility of directing activism toward a racially governing regime historically founded on the constitutive exclusion and violation of Blackness," end quote. This is not merely a feature of the American story, these thinkers should suggest. Rather, this is the American story. This story is not new. We have seen other versions of it. The 1960s, the 1920s. But I think its most powerful iteration can be found in the 1850s. So for the remainder of the talk, I want to return to the 1850s, and in particular, the debate between the Black nationalist, Martin Delany on the one hand, and Frederick Douglass on the other. I shall largely concentrate on Delany's signature work of political theory, Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, that he published in 1852. And Douglass's writings from that same period of the 1850s. And my aim is to try and tease out Douglass's response in his time to the pessimism of Delany, and perhaps I'll have time to suggest that it may be our response as well. We begin then with two passages. In a May 1852 letter to William Lord Garrison, Martin Delany writes the following: "I am not in favor of caste, nor separation of the brotherhood of mankind, and would as willingly live among white men as black, if I had an equal possession and enjoyment of privileges. If there were any probability, I should be willing to remain in the country fighting and struggling on, but I must admit that I have no hope in this country, no confidence in the American people." Frederick Douglass responds a year later to this sentiment with which he was familiar in May of 1853. This is Douglass. "We don't object to colonizationists because they desire the prosperity of Liberia." This was one of the countries proposed for black people to move to. "But it is because, like Brother Delany, they have not sufficient faith in the people of the United States to believe that the black man can ever get justice at their hands on American soil." There are two themes I would like to highlight from these passages. The first is the slide from hope in Delany's thinking to faith in Douglass's. And the second bears on the invocation of the people found in Douglass's passage. So the language of hope and faith are not synonyms. Hope, as Patrick Shade notes, is a, quote, active commitment to the desirability and realizability of a certain end, end quote. Indeed, it appears for Delany that hope is tied to confidence in bringing to fruition what one desires. As he suggests, hope stands within the world of probabilities informed by facts that provide indication of what is possible. "We must abandon," he says in chapter 16 of Condition, quote, "all vague theory and look at facts as they really are, viewing ourselves in our true political position in the body politic," end quote. But he appears to take those facts, at least in 1852, to be exhaustive, not only of what is, but what may be. In contrast to hope, faith, or so I shall tentatively say, is a passionate conviction coterminous with a vision of life or object not in existence. Now, both hope and faith are tied to something not yet in existence, but the source of difference between the two is that hope marks levels of confidence in achieving what is desired, while faith is the expression of a loving, even if difficult, commitment, precisely because there is no confidence to be had, at least based on some facts of the matter, in its realization. This, at least, appears to be one take on how these two concepts can fit together. Delany not only dispenses with hope because there is no evidence to sustain it, but more significantly, he is without faith that there is a narrative of American and African American life that can provoke whites to change, to dispense with the status they seemingly enjoy by virtue of being white. But why does he appear to be without faith? I think the answer to this relates to the three markers of what we might call Delany's pessimism. The first is what I will tentatively call the general burden of historical inegalitarianism. This is how he captures it in chapter 1 of Condition. Quote, "that there have been in all ages and all countries classes of people who have been deprived of equal privileges. These are historical facts that cannot be controverted," end quote. Now, Delany might be offering us a descriptive claim about the past, but I'm not sure that is exactly what he's doing. And this is because his claim about inegalitarianism comes in a chapter that bears the first substantive word of the title of his book, Condition. And for Delany, condition denotes the particular mode of a person or thing, the manner of the person or thing in question. And since he speaks of inegalitarianism as a condition of all ages and all countries, and given how the term functions in his text, there seems to be no good reason to believe this condition will disappear anytime soon, or in fact at all. It seems to me that what Delany is really doing is ontologizing historical facts as the immovable markers of human nature. It is not that the facts cannot be controverted, as he says, because they are the past, but because they define the temporal fields of the past, present, and future that humans have occupied, currently occupy, and may yet occupy. That is, human nature is the kind of nature, when understood socially, that generally produces political and ethical hierarchies to organize human relations. This is, for Delaney, the human condition. This leads, I think, to the second marker of Delaney's pessimism. He understands the practice of racial domination as defining what American society really is in itself. Racial domination in the United States turns out to be a localized manifestation of the general burden of historical inegalitarianism I just outlined. This is why he says, as I quoted earlier, we must take the facts as they really are. And of course, Delaney had much going for this idea in 1852, especially with the recent passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, in addition to the general state of black enslavement. Finally, the burden of historical inegalitarianism and its specific manifestation in racial domination in the United States appears to be effectively institutionalized via Delaney's positivism. Political life, Delaney thinks, is merely the attitudinal expression of the underlying ethos of the people. Listen to Delaney for a moment. Quote, among the whites, that color is made by law and custom, the mark of distinction and superiority, while the color of the blacks is a badge of degradation, acknowledged by statute, organic law, and the common consent of the people. With this view of the case, which we hold to be correct, to elevate to equality the degraded subject of law and custom, it can only be done by an entire destruction of the identity of the former condition of the applicant, end quote. Now, by identity here, Delaney has in mind the identity that is ascribed to African Americans by virtue of their race, what he calls the badge of degradation that is instantiated in the political, legal, cultural horizon of American life. The identity of white Americans partly comes about, or so Delaney suggests, by virtue of this contrast with their darker counterparts. And to overcome this condition requires that one destroy the badge of degradation, but this would also involve a willingness by white Americans to destroy the legal and customary badge of superiority they now flaunt. They must be willing to destroy, he argues, who they take themselves to be. And this would mean, in Delaney's mind, the overthrow of the American polity. This way of thinking informs his analysis in chapter 16 of Condition, where he explores the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. And he focuses on this law not because he believes positive law the primary site of justice, but because he takes the idea of law to be expressive of the underlying ethos or spirit of the people. And his analysis of the law turns on a distinction that he makes in Condition between moral law and physical or positive law, the constructed law of the state. And he tells us that the moral law is where one's sense of feeling and justice lies. And it is to be distinguished from positive law. And in the United States, Delaney argues, the law of the political state, the constructed law, is the result of a cooperative enterprise. The moral law, he goes on to say, need not necessarily determine and guide positive law. It is very possible for the polity to voluntarily construct laws that express their underlying commitments, and those laws be legitimate to that extent, even as those laws swing free of right and justice. This account leads Delaney to describe the Fugitive Slave Law as both legitimate and a monstrosity. These are his words. This is the law and must be obeyed. To suppose its repeal is to anticipate an overthrow of the Confederated Union, and candidly we believe the existence of the Fugitive Slave Law necessary to the continuance of the National Compact. Now we say necessary to the continuance of the National Compact, certainly we will not be understood as meaning that the enactment of such a law is really necessary, or as favoring in the least this political monstrosity. But we speak logically and politically, leaving morality and right out of the question, taking our position on the acknowledged popular basis of the American polity, end quote. The law, in its physical and positive character, crystallizes the background attitudinal orientation of the citizenry. It is the material expression, for Delaney, of the normative identity of the people. But it is an identity that stands apart from questions such as, is this right or is this just? One way to think about what Delaney is arguing is that there is a difference between the source or origin from which law issues and its content. Procedurally, if a law emerges from the polity's recognizable procedure, let's say through the requisite number of those appointed to Congress voting for it, it is legitimate to that extent. Legitimacy, as he sees it, is about the proper relationship between the physical law and those on whose behalf the law is issued and over whom is determined by the Constitution. Here, then, I think, is the upshot of Delaney's positivism as the final leg of his pessimism. Delaney connects the political foundations of American society to its largely white male voting population, and he then uses the outcome of their decisions as communicating who the citizenry really is and in what their commitments really consist. In a democratic-republican polity, the only political actors are those described by its constitutional order or physical laws. And for Delaney, if the Constitution expresses the concrete existence of the people, its ethical life, and is the only source of power, then there can be no other conception of the people not fixed by the political instruments that claim to speak in its name. Hence, he says, we are politically not of them, but aliens to the laws and political privileges of this country. These are truths, fixed facts, that quaint theory and exhaustive moralizing fall harmlessly before, end quote. Now, all of this, let's see if we can get some Douglas in here. Now, all of this contrasts quite sharply with Frederick Douglass. Firstly, in his 1852 address, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, Douglass holds fast to the idea that he can put the revolutionary spirit of 1776 in the service of a racially just society that has never before defined American life. For Douglass, the revolutionary spirit is the power for making and remaking society, and he thinks that inhabiting that revolutionary spirit and putting it in the service of a racially just society will be so compelling that his fellows will want to take it up. This partly seems to be the source of Douglass's invocation of faith. Now, admittedly, sometimes it is Douglass's religious commitments at work in forming his faith, and other times it's Douglass's vision of human nature that underwrites his faith. But more consistently, I think, it is faith in a specific idea of America. Whatever is hoped for seems to have no other ground than this idea itself. Returning to his 4th of July address, he says, I therefore leave off where I began with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. Here, hope draws encouragement from something, the ideas of the Declaration of Independence, but the something in question is wholly normative in character, rather than empirical in Delaney's sense of things. Douglass repeats the sentiment in the Dred Scott speech of 1857, but Douglass' hope and faith come together in a way that contrasts sharply with how it came together for Delaney and mirrors Hebrew 11:1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. This, I think, gives shape to the formal character of Douglass's faith. First, faith is a vision of political and ethical life that is at variance with the community he inhabits. Faith is a substantive vision he hopes will command allegiance because he believes it's a vision in which we all can find a home. And third, the substantive vision of his faith is something for which he is willing to fight to bring into existence. Two things, I'm going to draw this to a close, two things to note about the difference between Delaney and Douglass. First, Delaney treats the facts of racial domination as capturing the world as it really is in itself. He thinks those facts are expressive of a deeper historical logic that is merely playing itself out in the United States. Douglass rejects this kind of thinking and so rejects the burden of historical inegalitarianism. He refuses to remove the human element from the facts of American history, and he thinks that since the human element isn't the kind of thing that is fixed once and for all, there is no reason to think that the future need only be a replication of the past. Second, and this is quite important, I think, there appears to be an epistemological difference between Delaney and Douglass. There is a difference between a belief that is a conviction that some end should be supreme over conduct. Say, for example, belief that a racially just society is possible in the United States. There's a difference between that and a belief that some object exists as truth for the intellect. Say, for example, the sun will rise in the east and set in the west. where that claim is underwritten by a constellation of facts about the rotational axis of the Earth and the orbital path of the Earth in relation to the Sun. For Douglas, the first kind of belief, the one he holds, given the condition of African Americans, must function as a precondition for political engagement in the first place. So we might say a couple of things about this. First, you might say, as Delaney seemed to be saying, Douglas's position is just nonsense. If you take Douglas's position, it seems to involve black people in holding beliefs that are simply unreasonable for them to hold. And in fact, to the extent they hold beliefs of the first kind and use them to structure and organize their ethical and political engagement with the polity, they will find themselves dealing with white Americans and the nation state, that seem irredeemably unjust. They will find themselves holding ideas of an imaginary society, while the real American society leaves them open to disregard at best and premature death at worst. And we hear the echoes of this today in the position of the Afro-pessimist. I don't think Douglas can finally alleviate this worry. And this, of course, is the issue with the faith holders. They are often haunted by the ghost of a society they thought had long died, or if you would prefer to put the point more modestly, they're often confronted with sparks of life from a society they thought was on its deathbed. So the claim of the faith holders will always appear to be on shaky ground to those who seemingly believe that the motivation or lack thereof for political struggle is settled by the facts at hand. Beliefs held in the absence of those facts will appear unreasonable to those who seem to hold the facts. This brings me to the second and final observation. I don't know that the faith holders are naive. Douglas, for example, seemed just as realistic about America's past and present as it related to race relations, although he did not engage in the kind of ontologizing of history you see in Delaney. In fact, Douglas might be thought to hold a true realism for just this reason. As far as I can tell, Douglas was clear that America's past was bleak, and he seemed quite clear the prospect for the future was dim. America, he said in the 4th of July address, is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future, end quote. So Douglas's faith, given that statement, was not reasonable at all. But perhaps this is the unstated significant point about pushing for political and ethical transformation. A reasonable man, Toni Morrison tells us in her essay, Moral Inhabitants, adjusts to his environment. An unreasonable man does not. But to avoid the declarative, we might put it in the form of a question. When has transformation of the political and ethical kind ever come about because of reasonable people? Thank you.
So I'm a New York native, and I've had the privilege of giving lectures in the Midwest and in the South. And everywhere I go, people are always slowing me down. I talk too fast. So I'm trying to say to you tonight that now that I'm back home, I can finally unleash my powers. I've got 20 minutes, but I won't need it. Thank you for being with us tonight. You could be anywhere else right now, but you chose to be with us. I'm grateful for that. The title of my paper tonight is A Coming Out of Ourselves, Racial Injustice and Uses of Imagination. We are here this evening to intellectually honor the legacy of Ambedkar, who spent his life energetically educating himself in economics, pursuing a life in law and politics. He exerted himself on behalf of social justice, specifically challenging India's caste system. A caste system's main function is to sustain status designations for people so that they can, in effect, know where they belong in the social order. What is curious to me about a caste system is its ideational aspect. It assigns people status based on features such as religious practice, occupation, and notions of purity. A caste society is not structured on that which is real about people, whether they are, for example, wicked or good citizens. Those questions are preempted by value judgments calculated by the social imagination. I then get to thinking about America. We do not have a caste system of this sort, or do we? The problem of race and injustice in this country is stubbornly resilient, and though we commonly ascribe its stubbornness to institutional recalcitrance and intransigence, we would do well to remember that racism against blacks began with an idea, and not a reality. The idea that persons of African descent were barely human, and if they were, they nonetheless did not rise to the status of whites. That is really what it all came down to. A nation became a world power on the back of that idea. But more than that, generations of white Americans came into responsibilities of citizenship under the tutelage of a nation defined and habituated by that idea. Indeed, racial inequality is many things. It is tragic, horrific, murderous, impoverishing, but not less urgent, and possibly more fundamental. It is a failure of imagination. It is largely a failure of white Americans to come out of themselves and see a world beyond the ideas that affirm their status. The historical staying power of racial inequality indicates something resembling a commitment on behalf of whites in American society. What is this commitment? It is to sustain and retain a sense of self that is unperturbed by the fullest demands of morality. It is a commitment to wrap oneself in a morally truncated worldview such that one's racial existence seems consonant with a decent moral life merely on account of that racial existence. Of course, one's self-imposed illusions don't change the facts. If your actions systematically contribute, for example, to the underfunding of black schools, then you are in fact morally implicated in worsening the lives of black children. My view is that such truncations often essentially result in a failure of imagination. It is the inability to put our capacity for seeing beyond ourselves so that we may work at being our best selves. It is especially a failure of moral imagination as it indicates, willfully or not, a resistance to sufficiently flex our capacities for sympathy such that black lives enter whites' view as lives just like theirs. I don't think there is an easy or comprehensive solution to this problem. Alas, and disturbingly, there really might not be a solution to this problem at all. But let us in our time together tonight imagine that there might be. Which resources might we need and work toward that solution? That question on its own is susceptible to many approaches. Mine tonight emanates from a gumbo of professional philosophy, American essays, and black poetry to explore the problem of white failure at moral imagination. My aim during my time with you is to take you on a brief conceptual journey by way of staging for you two pairs of unlikely conversations. First, we will listen in on essayist James Baldwin and philosopher Rosalind Warhouse discuss the problem of personal virtue and why so many of us seem to fail at cultivating it when it matters most in matters of racial inequality and decency. Second, the philosophers Stephen Darwin and Charles Mills will exchange some ideas about why being white means being sympathetic, understanding of black life. And by the way, Charles is with us here tonight. Hi, Charles. This is not awkward. I will bring along some special guests to enliven these two conversations, the late essayist and novelist Toni Morrison, and who we've heard from in Melvin's presentation, and the poets Morgan Parker and Terrence Hayes. My hope is that you take up what is presented today with the willingness, even if just for a bit, to be other than who you are, if for no other reason than to see if you can be a bit more than that person usually is. The great American essayist and novelist James Baldwin indicted white Americans for two moral failures. First, for conveniently forgetting their history, and indeed, for believing that they are white in the first place. The first charge is important and stubbornly relevant. Always lurking in our public discourse is a sentiment to simply move on and let the past be the past. Such a sentiment indicates a discomfort with simple truths which introduce complex moral calculations such as what makes a white citizen today responsible for the effects of racial crimes that took place a century ago. Yet, that is not the failure which I want to draw your attention. Rather, I think we should pay special attention to the bizarre sounding criticism that the problem with white Americans is the bare fact that they believe they are white. What is the intended force of such a criticism? Maybe the place to begin is with Baldwin's equally urgent concern about the danger of blacks internalizing whites' beliefs about them. In My Dungeon Shook, which serves as a prelude to The Fire Next Time, Baldwin dryly laments that his nephew will never know Baldwin's father. He writes, quote, "Well, he is dead. He had a terrible life. He was defeated long before he died because at the bottom of his heart, he really believed what white people said about him," end quote. Baldwin's father, the son of former slaves and a man of God, died mentally ill. But the important part of the statement is not that Baldwin's father is dead, but that he was defeated, that he lost that living before he died. And more urgently, he lost that living because he believed what white people said about him. Baldwin doesn't need to offer any particulars here. It takes no imagination at all to suppose what it is white people said about blacks before the middle of the 20th century. What takes a bit more imagination to see that Baldwin is making an existential point here about the real personal impacts of social power once we succumb to its demands. One demand of white supremacy, for example, has always been that blacks should know that their lives are worth less than white lives, and that their existence is a matter of white grace. And should that grace ever expire, nothing but doom can follow. To take on such a view is to preempt the chance for personal flourishing, to curtail one's participation in freedom, and to deny one's own place in the social scheme as a person owed respect. I want to say at this point, for reasons that become clearer soon, that such an active diminishment of self runs counter to achieving what Aristotle called eudaimonia, happiness, achieving, flourishing. Thus, it violates living a life of virtue. The importance of the above, though portraying white Americans as in a position of power, lies in noticing that power and genuine freedom, itself evidenced by moral excellence, are not the same things. To have the power to shape the landscape of someone else's life is not the unidirectional power. To exercise that power is to be susceptible to it yourself. Shaping someone else's sense of self shapes your own sense of self. This is a simple enough dynamic to grasp, but one that takes a newly urgent meaning when racial power is involved. Racial power is itself devised upon fictions. Fictions that naturalize blackness as a thing in the world, fictions about the inferior nature of blackness, fictions about the nature of modern democracy such that blacks are unworthy of its boons. But none of those fictions can get off the ground without a more fundamental one, the fiction of whiteness. In one of his late essays, Baldwin identifies American communities that grounded in shared ethnic traditions, such as Irish and Jewish Americans. But he has this to say about whiteness, quote, Americans became white because of necessity of denying the black presence and justifying the black subjugation, end quote. The effect of whiteness as emanating from the desire to dominate others on the basis of skin color produces an important effect for us here tonight. Baldwin goes on to say, quote, this moral erosion has made it quite impossible for those who think of themselves as white in this country to have any moral authority at all, end quote. And the reason is simple. To have moral authority, one must in the first place possess the integrity of moral clarity. And moral clarity is itself a function of doing more than applying moral principles to oneself. It relies on something other and fundamental, and that is the ability to comprehend the sources of one's reasons. Reasons stabilize self-legislation, but reasons are also important in distinguishing good acts from bad. Rosalind Hursthouse writes, quote, the reasons given by the virtuous agent distinguish the way she is acting from the way the cowardly or licentious or greedy or self-seeking or merely docile agent happens to do the same sort of action. Thus, end quote, thus reasons indicate the moral integrity of actions, but actions themselves come into view as practical options on account of who we take ourselves to be, what we take ourselves to be about, and who we believe we are. The problem clearly arises that if who we think we are is itself unstable, so then must our reasons lose moral integrity. And that is why Baldwin is right to say that people who believe they are white have no moral authority. On this view, there's a calamitous slippage between one's moral powers and one's real social powers. For many whites, it is not yet registered that their political standing rests on the illusion of their identity for the precise reason that our society affirms their standing and status, but through injustice. Justice depends then on a human capacity that is constantly undermined by our social structures. Whites' failure to see past the boundaries of one's own world to another is precisely a failure of imagination. The failure to act well among blacks on account of this inability is precisely a failure of moral imagination. What kind of considerations, perspective, and content might help correct that failure? Let us begin with some select lines from Morgan Parker's poem, I feel most colored when I am thrown against a sharp white background. This is what she writes. I feel most colored when I swear to God. I feel most colored when it is too late, when I am captive. The last thing on my mind is death. I feel most colored when I am thrown against a sidewalk. It is the last time I feel colored. Stone is the name of the fruit. I am thrown bone, unarmed. I feel most colored when my weapon is I, when I get what I deserve, when I can't breathe. I feel most colored when I'm the punchline, when I'm the trigger. I feel most colored when I'm collecting dust, when I'm impatient and sick, when they use us to distract us. Parker's poem offers a kaleidoscopic insight into the near mania of being Black in America. Through the poem, we are transported through anger and despair, violence and a tenuous grasp on life, on social ridicule and being weaponized in service of one's own marginalization. Life can be difficult for anyone in this country, but the point of Parker's poem is that there are difficulties and then there are Black difficulties, and that those difficulties result from a nation whose system of social value is broken and corrupt. But the deeper value of Parker's poem is that it provides one window, though surely not the only one, into Black life. It helps answer the question, what is it like to live while Black in America? This might seem a simple and straightforward goal, but this question contains great moral weight. Indeed, the importance of endeavoring to access a standpoint outside of our own in service of acting rightly and good is an essential theme in moral theory. Consider Stephen Darwall's work on a second personal standpoint. Darwall perceives the possible point of slippage in the Kantian moral tradition. Abiding by the moral law, many affirm our status as rational legislators, but then that may not get us all the way to doing the right thing for other people. Put differently, Kantian theory is starkly asocial. The second personal standpoint is an attempt to articulate at least one aspect of the bond between moral agents. Part of what we do, Darwall holds, when we direct our address to another person is to presume authority to demand recognition. But the demand isn't a flat one, and the authority to do so is not merely unidirectional. As Darwall puts it, quote, this is what brings our respective perspectives into the interaction and requires that we be able to take each other's perspective up. I must be able to see the other's response to my address as more or less rational from her point of view. I must be able to see my address through her eyes. Similarly, for her to make sense of my address, she has to see it as something that makes sense from my perspective. End quote. But there can be problems here. Namely, what if the person in front of me does not register my standing to have authority in the first place? What if the person before me, either explicitly or implicitly, believes my own standpoint to be illegitimate or inconvenient or negligible? And what if that very attitude is not a feature of idiosyncratically maladjusted social agent, but is rather one that is common in society towards members of particular social groups? To the point here, what if whiteness is an obstacle to second personal address? In White Right, the idea of heroic ethics, Charles Moses is particularly concerned with the way a history of white supremacy has destabilized philosophy's ability to perceive its own cultural priors when making ethical recommendations. But fundamental to that concern is a broader concern about whites' seemingly inability to see beyond the boundaries of the cultural life world that mainly affirms their ascendancy and at best minimizes social ontology of blacks and other groups. Mills writes, tacit in conversation with James Baldwin, quote, the moral education of whites tends to be deficient because the examples that are called upon to illustrate make vivid and fix in their minds the appropriate abstract moral concepts are prototypically white experiences, end quote. The central claim, I think, can be unpacked this way. First, there are abstract moral principles, and these can be fine for anyone in most situations, but Mills is a non-ideal theorist, so just having the principles is not going to get us to where we need to go regarding racial morality. So second, we have to identify potential obstacles, and the main one is this. Whites reach for examples that cohere with their experiences. This affirms a tendency to, as Baldwin charges, believe one is white. But there is more. Third, this will burden white Americans' ability to take up a proper second personal standpoint. My ability to share with you a claim that I am confident we take up from our point of view is immediately at risk. Thus, so is my authority in our exchange. An important implication that has been lurking in our conversation this evening is that this dynamic will pose serious problems with regards to moral motivation. For our purposes, I will say that moral motivation is just that capacity that gets us off the moral bench and into the game of moral life, among others, when it counts most. What happens when failures of moral imagination lead to failures of moral motivation? Well, whites will fail to see the way black lives don't always matter so much. They will fail to understand that the following scene from Terence Hayes' American Sonnets from My Past and Future Assassins is not exceptional but racially normal for blacks. In other words, when we think morally, this kind of scene is part of how we inform moral abstractions. Hayes writes in his sonnet, "Probably twilight makes blackness dangerous, darkness. Probably all my encounters are accidental jambalaya, which is to say, a nigga can survive. Something happened in Stanford, something happened in Ferguson, and Brooklyn, and Charleston. Something happened in Chicago, and Cleveland, and Baltimore, and happens almost everywhere in this country every day. Probably someone is preying over our encounters. We won't admit it. The names alive are like the names in graves." Hayes' poem is kaleidoscopic in a different manner than Morgan Parker's. Where Parker brought to our consideration the various sufferings blacks must endure just to live in their skin, Hayes focuses squarely on black mortality and calls to our attention that any one event you see on the news is ubiquitous for too many blacks wherever they call home in this country. Baltimore is just like Charleston, is just like Brooklyn. The point I want to press is that it is the stuff of our lived experiences and of those close to us in a relevant sense that chisel and shape our moral attitudes and how informed we might be in the moment in making a moral choice. America is radically unjust, and blacks have not only known this for a long time, but have developed moral routines and perspectives in conversation with that reality. As Mills insists, their prototypically white experiences, which do not include being shot by police, being denied jobs because of their name, being ridiculed for your ethnic hair, having a hard time being taken seriously in hospitals, their experiences do not flag America as a fundamentally troubled nation. And in my view, if one cannot experience these things firsthand, all that is left are acts of imagination to comprehend what is otherwise unperceived in a direct sense. My further claim is that once whites do this, they can comprehend that in many ways their own lives are founded on imagination, though misguided. They can stop believing they are white, and in doing so be better positioned to not merely take what we say seriously, but take up what we say in ways that make sense in the appropriate manner. They can come out of themselves and take possession of a moral excellence that has long eluded them, and which our republic increasingly needs if we are to achieve our collective promise to be America. Already quoted tonight, but at greater length, Toni Morrison writes, "Our past is bleak, our future is dim, but I am not reasonable. A reasonable man adjusts to his environment, an unreasonable man does not. All progress therefore depends on the unreasonable man. I prefer not to adjust to my environment. I refuse the prison of I," end quote. And I choose to open the spaces of we, sorry. This is fine enough advice for black Americans. But what if white Americans were unreasonable in this way and refused the fiction of a white environment? What if they refused the privilege that attaches to their invocation of I? What if instead, with a generous spirit, chose the open spaces of we? Imagine that. Thank you.
So Martin Luther King famously argued that no social advance rolls in on the wheels of inevitability, but that it depends on the tireless effort and constant devotion of passionate individuals. And you'll know, those of you who know the text know I'm paraphrasing because he says it so often. One of the insights that emerges from all three of the papers that we've had delivered this evening is that even the most passionate individuals cannot persist in, or I think even begin a struggle for justice without imagination, as discussed in Professor Lebron's paper, or without hope, as discussed in different ways by Professor Krishnamurthy and Professor Rogers. Indeed, I'm going to argue that the idea that pursuing justice demands imagination and hope richly and fully animates the thought and the practice of virtually all the political thinkers discussed here this evening. So I begin by reflecting on the role of imagination, and by urging that all the thinkers, Dewey, Du Bois, Baldwin, and Ambedkar, appreciated the role of imagination in creating space for progressive social change. Each of these thinkers called upon their audiences to imagine that the world could be better than it was when they wrote, that we could abolish the structures that secure and protect racial oppression, that we could annihilate caste, and that we could come to view democracy not just as a set of institutions, but as a creative and continually reinvigorating way of life. And even though Dewey is only hovering in the background here, it's not unimportant that Dewey, at a moment in 1939 when people thought that the future of democracy was quite uncertain, invited us to imagine a political community that would realize justice by securing for each person equal opportunity for development of whatever gifts he has, and a life free from coercion and imposition by others. But it must also be emphasized that all the thinkers considered today also asked us to reflect on the distressing facts of injustice, to imagine the depth of the suffering and loss that injustice produces, and the strength of its targets' desires for redress of their grievances and for repair of the wrongs they have endured. All the thinkers we've heard about this evening believe that imagination should not only offer realistic utopias, to use a phrase from John Rawls, but that it should confront us with the dystopian elements of the world that they actually inhabited. So just as they presented us with democratic vistas, they did so only alongside the undemocratic realities of sustained oppression. But second, all of the figures whose thought and practice we've contemplated today also understood how critical hope is to the fight against injustice. And remember, hope, I'm going to insist, like Professor Rogers, is not the same thing as optimism. And this fact, I think, deserves special notice because present company accepted, many contemporary political thinkers don't talk about hope at all. And even some who do seldom recognize that it's a critical element of the moral psychology that makes constructive social change possible. And some even deride hope as nothing more than wishful thinking, somehow fundamentally irrational, because it's insufficiently rooted in the facts of the so-called real world. But wishing and hoping are not the same. In particular, we can wish for things that we don't believe could ever happen. I can wish to live forever. I can wish to soar like an eagle over the skyscrapers in Manhattan. In contrast, hope is expectant desire, a quasi-cognitive stance that combines wanting something to happen or be true with believing that it could really happen or be true. Indeed, because hope is an attitude that combines desire with belief, our hopes, unlike our wishes, can be more or less reasonable. And indeed, the capacity to form reasonable hopes often plays a central role in the pursuit of constructive change. But I submit that Du Bois, Ambedkar, Baldwin, Dewey could all agree that we must leave room for what Jonathan Lear called radical hope. That hope that we hold on to, even when the world doesn't make it so reasonable to have hope, and even when the world makes it seem, at least from the outside, entirely unreasonable to have hope. This is the kind of hope to which James Baldwin refers, for instance, in a 1978 interview with German writer Fritz Radatz, when he remarked, and here I quote, "I'm an American Negro writer. I live with a hope, despite knowing better." But it's also the kind of hope that sustained Nelson Mandela during 27 long years in prison. In The Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela movingly describes his participation in the custom of naming his grandchild. This was a ceremony that they actually allowed to take place before he was freed, and here I quote, "The name I'd chosen was Zaziwe, which means hope. The name had special meaning for me, for during all my years in prison, hope never left me, and now it never would. I was convinced that this child would be part of a new generation of South Africans for whom apartheid would be a distant memory." Of course, radical hope is not the only hope that matters for those who seek to create and sustain justice. In a wonderful excerpt from his writings and speeches, Ambedkar talks about the importance of protecting conditions for a more ordinary kind of hope. Here I quote, "The main reason," he says, "for lack of enthusiasm on the part of a man is that he loses the hope of getting an opportunity to elevate himself. Hopelessness leads to lack of enthusiasm, but when is enthusiasm created? When one breathes an atmosphere where one is sure of getting the legitimate reward for one's labor. Only then one feels enriched by enthusiasm and inspiration," end quote. Ambedkar is urging here that everyday sustainable enthusiasm for life depends upon getting some kind of confirmation that it is reasonable to have hope. Yet despite the importance of this ordinary hope, I still suspect that in the course of any effort to stand up to human evil, and to seek redress of political injustice. It's radical hope that is the only reliable source of psychological resilience, of courage to endure to endure despite adversity and disappointment, and that it is the only reliable and dependable antidote to despair. The very possibility of radical hope provides an important reminder of a truth that King struggled with in one of his last sermons, and that's the truth with which I began, that hope is not the same thing as optimism. Optimism is generally expecting the best to happen, but having hope is entirely compatible with acknowledging that we must be prepared for the worst to happen, and even to acknowledge that the worst that can happen is often a consequence of injustice. Of course, it is that continued reality of social injustice that reminds us of just how hard it can be to hold on to radical hope. And it's tempting to think that radical hope is really accessible in the end only to figures of extraordinary moral strength, like Ambedkar, like King, like Baldwin, like Mandela. But in my view, African-American political thought and African-American literary culture are in many respects a continuing testimony to the possibility of radical hope. And we hear that testimony in the work of thinkers as varied as Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and James Baldwin. And I also suggest that it is the fact that the African-American struggle for justice is so deeply rooted in this commitment to radical hope that it's been able to have such a remarkable influence on social movements around the globe, including on Ambedkar's efforts to dismantle the caste system in India. Now, in my view, the African-American commitment to radical hope is most powerfully expressed in the Black Jeremiah, a tradition animated by the insight that it's possible to combine righteous indignation at a society's persistent failures to achieve justice with unrelenting hope for that society's moral renewal. Cultural historians have rightly treated this combination of anger and hope as a distinctively African-American variant of the rhetorical ritual known as the American Jeremiah. But unlike the more generically American approach, the African-American version is not essentially an effort to preserve some allegedly endangered moral status quo from decline. In fact, it presumes that the status quo is deeply immoral, and it insists that it's only through the redress of American racial injustice that we could take the first critical steps along the path to America's moral renewal. James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time remains one of the most effective examples of this project, with the book's closing call to end America's racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. Richard Rorty compellingly argued in his book, Achieving Our Country, borrowing, of course, from the last line of Baldwin's book for his title, that Baldwin's Jeremiah must be located squarely in the tradition of American democratic thought. And indeed, I take that book to be an exemplar of that tradition, echoing Dewey's call for us to take up the task of creative democracy, but doing so more fully rooted in an understanding of just how far America needed to go in order to complete that task. Of course, as Professor Rogers reminded us, the readiness to take up the task demands extraordinary faith, especially when we strive to create a genuine democracy despite the durability of grave injustice. It is thus that the most compelling theorists of democracy, Lincoln, Whitman, Dewey, Baldwin, draw on their faith in the possibility of social progress and in the capacities of human beings to desire and promote it. And it is thus that the most influential political activists are animated by their faith that the goals that they seek are more important than any sacrifices and suffering they might endure in the pursuit. But such faith can be sustained only when we are willing to draw upon the power of imagination to present new social possibilities, and when we are able to retain robust hope that it might be possible to realize the democratic vistas that imagination presents.
My brief remarks are motivated by the thought that we are, with respect to race in America, at what might be called a Gramscian moment, where the old has died and the new has not yet been born. This is a fraught moment, a moment of tension and contradiction. And I'd like to ask a question which might seem even slightly ridiculous, which is, under what conditions can a caste system and can caste itself become both equal and voluntary? Why am I asking that question? It might, as a footnote, and there are Gandhi specialists in the room, Gandhi in the teens, for example, in defending caste, also spoke of caste as potentially equal, and he fought against untouchability in a quest not to end the caste system, but to transform it. And those very difficult and puzzling texts, especially for someone whose knowledge of India is weak and whose sense of the ideas, even the debates between Gandhi and Ambedkar is deficient. Nonetheless, I've been provoked to try to think about that question by looking at the Gandhian side of the debate with Ambedkar. And then I recently came across a text I had not known by Ambedkar, The Annihilation of Caste, which was a lecture originally scheduled to be given in 1936, but then it was canceled because the text included a sentence about Hinduism as, quote, a veritable chamber of horrors. And once that line, I think, was discovered, that the lecture was canceled. But he rewrote it twice, 1937 and then again in 1944. It's recently been published in Delhi in an edition I, by chance, came across. And he wrote in that text, there cannot be a more degrading system of social organization than the caste system. And if you think about the United States in these terms, there was, as Fred Harris said, a kind of debate in America in the 40s about how to characterize American race relations. Oliver Cox, his late 1940s book, Cox was a brilliant Marxist, analyst of race, argued, and I'm simplifying the argument, it was a complex book, but in his book, Caste, Class, and Race, argued for class analysis above a caste analysis. A fairly orthodox Marxist analysis, and arguing that racial inequality could be surmounted and overcome if only the class system were itself overcome. But in the very last, the year in which Ambedkar rewrote his lecture, the lecture he didn't deliver, this great book, Black Metropolis, a study of Negro life in a northern city, Chicago, which Fred and I and a group of others are reading currently, rereading, made the argument, anticipating Cox in a way, that it's caste, not class, that best described the American racial experience, and for two reasons, they argued. One was, we already heard the theme about endogamy, that on the whole, 1944 black-white marriage bordered on the impossible. And second, they argued, Caton and Drake argued, St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton argued that mobility, a class system not only allows for intermarriage, but a class system across class lines, a class system allows for mobility from lower to upper, or downward mobility, whereas a caste system rigidly divides so that mobility of the lower caste cannot, a person in that caste cannot rise above the position of one in a higher caste. And therefore, American race relations was more caste-like than class-like. The puzzle I want to raise, and when I say the old has died and new has yet been born, is that already in this book of Black Metropolis, we see the old dying. I'll just quote from one page. This is near the end, page page 778, in which they're quoting from a research paper done by graduate students for this book. And it says, the authors of the graduate student authors concluded that the structural organization of the Negro-white ranking can be summarized as follows: that the Negro and black metropolis, more than not, is subordinated to menial tasks, but nevertheless has some chance for job advancement. That the Negro has made real political gains, both in voting and political power. That in his social relations with whites, there is a high degree of exclusion. And that while intermarriage is legally sanctioned, it is generally discouraged. Now that's not a quote about racial justice or equality, but almost each clause betrays a somewhat weakened caste system. The vote is here where it wasn't in Jim Crow South. The intermarriage is not illegal in Chicago, as it would have caused you to be lynched if you tried it in Mississippi, and so on and so forth. So you get the kind of breaking of caste. And that led me, if you will allow me to be a bit discursive for a moment, back to Du Bois and to Souls, which of course is a much older book. But the central theme, as you all know, of that book is what he called the two-ness. One ever feels his two-ness, TWO. An American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And then, of course, at the very end, he points out to Americans more generally, would America have been America without her Negro people? And there, the Americanness in tension with the apartness of being a separate caste in America, that tension is articulated. And what happens between Souls and Drake, St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton's book, is the beginning of a deeply uncertain, vexed, often violent, and still often oppressive breaking apart of arrangements that had thought to be so caste-like in their ultimate permanent rigidity. And that leads me to the question of under what conditions can the caste system become more voluntary, open, and in the Gandhian words, equal. It's a great puzzle, it seems to me, and I don't know the answer, but there's one more text, if I can cite, and then I want to say 2 minutes worth of conclusion about how to probe that question. The other text is something Michael Walzer wrote in 2004, an article called "What Does It Mean to Be an American?" And there he celebrated the hyphenated American states, Polish American, Irish American, German American, etc. And he said the great feature of this ethnicity, not caste, not race, ethnicity, was that it was voluntary on both sides of the hyphen. That is, the degree of thickness or thinness was voluntary. So one can be a Polish American and live then, today it's gentrified, but in Greenpoint in Brooklyn, and live in a neighborhood in which the Polishness was thicker than the Americanness. That is, every street sign, every shop was in Polish language. This is 15 years ago in America. But of course, they're still American. Or you have Polish people in America, you look at them, you talk to them, you wouldn't have a clue they're Polish. Because they've thinned out the Polishness and thickened the American side of the story. And that double voluntarism seems to me to be, to quote again John Rawls, a kind of realistic utopianism. That is, it's a form of voluntarism and equality, or potential equality, which is available, has been available only in a limited way in America. And the question is, can those who've been embedded in, encompassed in, imprisoned in a caste system achieve or have access to that level of double voluntariness of having identity as African American, Americans of African descent? Is the Polish American model in any sense truly available? Well, we know it's not truly available equally in the same precise way. But the old has died and the new has not yet been born. And I want to just close with essentially a social science question, which I won't probe at all now. But if you think about racism and deep inequality of the caste system as existing at multiple levels, they include a spatial dimension, that is racial segregation. This institution, when I was an undergraduate, was all white and all male. Well, not Barnard, I mean Columbia, across the street. All women, men. But overwhelmingly, almost exclusively white. Not perfect today, but the old has died and the new has not yet been born. Physical security. Police violence is, well, we talked about this evening. This is not a world of physical security for people of color, but it's also not the world of thousands lynched with mobs uninterrupted by police. The old has died, the new has not yet been born. Or material possibilities and aspiration. The gap between the poorest and the best off people of color in America is significantly wider than it was in the old, where there was a black middle class in the South, say in Jim Crow South, but it was much more compressed in the social structure with respect to those at the very bottom. Today there's a much wider spectrum. And then the question of culture, the incorporation or the absorption or the synergies of culture across racial caste lines. That's changed, certainly in my lifetime. And finally, there's civic participation, voting, and so on. In a way, I'm more impressed by the fact that two also running candidates for President of the United States, two United States senators, one from New Jersey and one from California, can contest the presidency with the same degree of lack of chance as most of the white people on the stage. But that's would have been inconceivable, let alone the election of an African American to the presidency, certainly in my childhood. So that the old is dying or dead, and the new is yet to be born. And my question would be, how does variation in each of these five dimensions of segregation, security, physical security and security, material earnings and wealth abilities, culture and civic life, how does variation at one level affect the prospects at other levels to shatter the caste system? And that's, seems to me, a profound and fundamental challenge to which I wish I knew the answer. But I think for the next quarter century or more, this society, American society, will be navigating that question and will hopefully, not certainly, be able to transcend the old sufficiently. I said it died, but entirely died. So that we no longer can say that the American caste system, the racial caste system, is the most degrading system of social organization that we know. Thank you.